From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives, and a special welcome to those of you joining us by YouTube and our friends on C-SPAN. With the National League Division Series coming to Washington this afternoon, it's only appropriate that we have a discussion about Major League Baseball and its presence and absence in the nation's capital. We welcome a guest who has written extensively about baseball in Washington over the years, including those years when we had no team. Even when we did have a team, things were grim, summarized in the old saying, first in war, first in peace, last in the American League. This has been replaced by Natitude. Before I turn the program over to today's guest, I want to tell you about two programs upcoming in this theater. Next Wednesday on October 8th at 7, we'll present a program entitled Courtroom Drama, covering the Supreme Court. It will feature a panel of journalists who have covered the Supreme Court from various perspectives and who have all written books about the High Court. On Friday, October 10th at noon, we're offering a program entitled Kennesaw, One Last Mountain. Early on June 27, 1864, Union officers received an order from General William Tecumseh Sherman to assault Confederate forces entrenched along the Kennesaw Mountain line as Sherman continued his march to Atlanta. A film, Kennesaw, One Last Mountain, brings to life this dramatic Civil War story, and a discussion will follow that program. To learn more about these and all of our programs, there are copies of the monthly calendar of events in the lobby, as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it by regular mail or email, and you'll also find brochures about other National Archives programs and exhibits. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership in the lobby also. And a little secret that I keep sharing with everyone, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the Foundation. Now let's get this game underway. Few books about baseball would be without the results of some research in the National Archives. We have records on baseball, such as transcript of congressional hearings on baseball's antitrust exemption, President Roosevelt's green light letter giving his blessing to continuing Major League Baseball during World War II, and patents for gloves and catcher's gear. And there are lots of photos of presidents tossing out the first pitches and famous players performing their military service. Frederic Fromer drew on tapes of conversations President Nixon had with Washington's mayor about efforts to get a new team for the city after the Senators announced they were moving to Texas for the 1972 season. Mr. Fromer is an Associated Press reporter and author of 4 books on baseball. His latest book is You Gotta Have Heart, A History of Washington Baseball from 1859 to the 2012 National League East champions. George Will, a long-suffering Chicago Cubs fan, says, "No fan's library should be without this book." The Wall Street Journal called it an absolute treat, as it will be for anyone who just happens to like a good baseball yarn. At the Associated Press, Frommer has covered a host of beats, including one he created on the intersection of sports and politics and the U.S. courthouse, where he covered the Roger Clemens perjury trial. Before joining AP, Mr. Frommer worked at CNN and the Washington Post. He has also freelanced for several publications, including the Post, the New York Times, and Politico. He's been interviewed by many media outlets, including the Times, NPR, ABC News, ESPN Radio, and Sirius XM Radio. Mr. Frommer will be joined today in his discussion about baseball by Phil Hochberg. You might not recognize his face, but you probably have heard his voice. As an avocation, Mr. Hochberg does public address announcing at sporting events and was the first baseball and last football stadium announcer in the first 37 years at the RFK Stadium. He spent 38 years with the Washington Redskins and is the first person who was not a player, coach, or owner to be honored by the team in its Hall of Fame Ring of Stars. Previously, he announced for the Washington Senators, the Baltimore Orioles, and teams for George Washington University and the University of Maryland and American University. He's also announced 7 presidential inaugural parades. Last year, he was inducted into the Washington, D.C. Sports Hall of Fame. Please welcome Frederic Frommer and Phil Hochberg.
Thank you all for coming, and a special thanks to David and the San Francisco Giants for winning their game the other night. So you could all be here instead of at the park at a noon game. You probably heard about this film that was just discovered of the 7th game of the 1924 World Series. We're going to start off the program just showing you that. I just want to set it up for you a little bit. Obviously, the teams, the Giants, the Nationals, also known as the Senators, had split their first 6 games of the World Series. And in the 7th game, Walter Johnson came in out of the bullpen in the 9th inning of a tie game. Now, Johnson had lost his first 2 starts, including games 1 and game 5. And it looked like he was going to go out as a 2-time loser because he didn't have any more scheduled starts. The New York Times called him the most tragic figure in baseball. Well, he has his chance for redemption, and I'll let the film take it from here. If you can roll the film, please.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.
Although this year we'll probably match it or exceed it. Senator fans, Fred cautioned me not to go too far, but there were a number of errors in that film. I guess the most specific one was in the shot that they showed where the Senators tied the score. You'll notice it was the end of the inning, and the batter was out at first, and the run doesn't count. So, in fact, that was the following inning. The Nationals had the Senators had tied the game in the 8th, and that was, they had men on first and third in the 9th with one out, and batter hit into a double play. So they ended up going to 12 innings. Fred, you agree that that was a pretty spectacular day?
Amazing, and I've seen that film, of course, many times, but never on a big screen like this, so that was fantastic. And, you know, the city went completely crazy, as you saw, the fans rushing the field. But beyond that, fans were dancing on the dugouts. Police had to come in to rescue the players from the mobs of fans that were crowding around them. There were so many people jamming the streets that night that the cars had to go on the streetcar tracks. It was an amazing time, and hopefully we'll repeat it this year.
Of course, the great hero was Walter Johnson, and Walter Johnson was nowhere to be found after the game. Well, he ended up going to the Occidental Restaurant on Pennsylvania Avenue, 14th in Pennsylvania, where he had dinner with his wife that night. And if you ever go into the Occidental, which has pictures of celebrities all over the restaurant, you walk in, and just to the right, as soon as you walk in, is a picture of Walter Johnson, Washington's hero. And of course, for those of you who may not be from the Washington area, Walter Johnson High School in Bethesda, named after the pitcher, and with a big statue of Walter Johnson in front of it. But Fred, we're talking about 90 years ago, almost to the day, right?
And tomorrow is the 90th anniversary of the first game of that World Series.
How did you get the idea for the book?
Well, I'd written a couple of books before. I was living here for a few years. I'd kind of really gotten into the city, and actually my publisher approached me and asked me when the Expos moved down here about writing a book about Washington baseball history, and I thought, yeah, it sounds like a great idea. And the more I got into it, the more I saw how many interesting stories and great history there was to it.
This is the second edition, is it not?
That's right. The first edition came out in 2006, right after the team moved here, and a new edition came out last year.
And the title, what's the title?
Well, you know, despite what you saw today about this very happy time in Washington baseball history, that was kind of an outlier. For the most part, Washington was not a very good team. In fact, there was an expression about Washington baseball: first in war, first in peace, and last in the American League. So it was, you know, it was a tough time.
It may have been, but how about the title? Yeah.
So the title, there was a Washingtonian who was so frustrated at seeing his team always come in last place and lose out to the Yankees that he writes a novel about a middle-aged man who sells his soul to the devil to become transformed into Joe Hardy, this young, strapping center fielder who leads his team to the pennant over the Yankees. Now that's turned into a play called Damn Yankees. And in that play, there's a line in a music. There's actually a song called "You Gotta Have Heart," where a manager is actually singing to his players, which is, I didn't realize this, but managers do that a lot. I found they often sing to their players to inspire them.
Matt Williams,
right? But a postscript on that. That play opened on Broadway in 1955. In real life, in Washington baseball, the Senators came in last place, 43 games behind the Yankees. So it truly was a work of fiction.
Say, before we abandon the 24 World Series, I went back this morning and did a little research. The New York Giants fielded a starting lineup with 7 future Hall of Famers. 7 out of their 9 starters are now in the Hall of Fame. The Washington Senators started 3 future Hall of Famers, and then when Walter Johnson came in the 9th inning, that made a 4th. Fred, which Hall of Famers are going to be playing today?
He warned me he was going to ask you this question. I think that Strasburg and Bryce Harper are two possibilities, but it's still early to say at this point.
Okay.
What do you think?
That could be Buster Posey.
That's true.
Could be Wilson Ramos. No way. Let's hope he has a good series. I don't think that that the Buffalo is going to be in the Hall of Fame. Rookie manager. Unusual. Rookie manager in the World Series.
Right. Bucky Harris. That's the guy you saw hitting the home run. And just also an interesting side note, he had 2 home runs in that World Series. In the regular season, he had only 1 home run, and partly because they had some makeshift bleachers and they made it a little easier. But he had an incredible series. He was the 27-year-old player manager that the owner, Clark Griffith, gave him the job before the season. And before that, the Senators really weren't even on anyone's radar. They had a sub-500 year the previous few seasons. And Griffith thought, I like this guy. He's feisty. He's got some personality, and he's got the personality of a tiger. Let's give this guy a chance. Now, sports writers thought this was such a bad idea, they called it Griffith's folly. Well, by the end of the season, obviously, Harris leads the Senators to the pennant, and he gets them to a second pennant the next year, 1925. They lose the World Series against the Pirates that year.
And he was known thereafter not as Griffith's folly, but as the boy wonder.
Right.
27-year-old manager. First time that Griff tried that?
It was the first time, but he tried it again 9 years later. So after Harris left, he actually turned to Walter Johnson for a few years as manager, and he actually was pretty good. Had a lot of second-place finishes, but he couldn't get them over the top. He couldn't get them into the World Series. So Griffith fires Johnson, and he hires an even younger manager, a 26-year-old guy named Joe Cronin, to be his player manager. Now, Cronin had the same kind of makeup, very fiery, very intense personality. That team actually had even a better record. I believe it's the best record in Washington baseball history, something about a .630 winning percentage. They lose the World Series to the Giants, rather. And the next year they fall to 7th place, and Clark Griffith sells Cronin, his star player manager, to the Red Sox for $250,000. Making matters even worse is that Cronin was Griffith's own son-in-law. So I don't know how you want to psychoanalyze that move.
I started following baseball in 1948, and I was from 48 to 71 when the expansion Senators left. Just to give you an idea of what a wasteland Washington baseball was, they finished above 500 twice. From 1948 to 1971. In 60 they left. In 60 they left to go to Minneapolis, became the Minnesota Twins, and in 71, after the expansion team was granted to Washington, Bob Short took them to Texas, and someone, in fact, I think it might have been you, Fred, who asked me, do you think that there's any sort of devilish delight that Washington fans are taking in the fact that the Twins and the Texas Rangers finished last this year? There might be some devilish delight, if you will. In terms of the book, were any particular seasons outstanding in your mind?
Well, really only those 3 years. There were interesting seasons. Ted Williams, for example, in 1969, was another rookie manager, actually, several years after he retired as a player. And Bob Short hired him to shake things up. There's a second version of the Senators that Phil alluded to. They hadn't had any winning seasons up until then. And he leads them to a winning record, about 10 games over 500, a pretty good season. Still not good enough for anything better than 4th place in a very tough division. So that was an exciting time. Ted Williams is very good at getting his players, almost had like an early Moneyball approach to baseball. He encouraged Frank Howard, many of you have heard of, a very famous Washington slugger, to try to take more pitches, to get more walks. And Howard wound up having a great year. He walked over 100 times, and he didn't lose any of his power. There's a funny story, actually, about that, though. There used to be, and I'm sure there still are, at RFK Stadium in the upper deck, they painted the seats white to mark where Frank Howard hit these home runs, these monstrous home runs, 500 feet. And as Frank Howard told me the story, one day Ted Williams was talking to a friend of his during batting practice. The friend was pointing out to those seats, and he says, "Oh my God, did Frank Howard really hit the ball? All those white seats?" And Ted Williams said, "Yeah. You see those other 5,000 seats up there?" He says, "Yeah. Those are all the times he struck out on me."
The Expansion Senators, the club that I worked for as a PA announcer, stadium announcer, really was a terrible team. But you know, while baseball in Washington was a wasteland until 1971, it was a desert for the following 34 years. In your research, what did you see? What was unusual about how baseball came back to Washington?
Well, Major League Baseball really had written off Washington as a market. You know, it had lost 2 teams, and there were some good crowds in the heydays, but when the Senators left, both franchises were drawing very poorly at the very end there. For example, the second Senators averaged only 8,000 fans a game in 1971. They actually had a very big crowd by those standards, 14,000 for their very last game, where they had a lead over the Yankees and they wound up forfeiting because the fans rushed the field before the final out. So people in Major League Baseball just didn't think it was a good market. And part of that was because they lost 2 teams. Part of it is the sort of stuck in the past mentality or their vision of what Washington was. You know, Washington was a much smaller city in the 60s and earlier. It was a small, kind of southern, sleepy city. Much bigger market now, much wealthier. And so they finally came around, and they really needed a place to park the Montreal Expos because there was no other good and viable market. And I think those 2 factors led them to come here in 2005.
In your research, did you find any fan reaction to losing the 2 clubs?
Yeah, people. Well, I'd throw it back to you. I mean, tell me how you felt about it. You have a great line about what it was like to lose that second Senators franchise.
Yeah. The first Senators team moved to Minneapolis, and I think that there was an attitude here in Washington toward Calvin Griffith, who succeeded in the ownership of the club after his uncle Clark died. That good riddance. Okay, we got another club. The 1960 Senators weren't that good, although by 1965 they won the pennant, and they did have some great players, Killebrew and Bob Allison and Jim Cott and Zora Versailles. But at least we had a team. In '71, I can remember my reaction, my own personal reaction. It was as if somebody had died in my family. I mean, a feeling of, this was an important part of my life, and I suspect an important part of a lot of people's lives, but it was a feeling of total powerlessness that here's something important had happened to me, and I couldn't do anything about it. And it just, you go into a funk over it. Fred, let me pose this question to you. People say, well, yeah, this is the national second pennant in 3 years.
Second postseason appearance.
Yeah. Well, they won the National League East in both.
Division, right?
Yeah. And people say, well, the Montreal Expos were a pretty good team for a number of years. In the strike-shortened season, they had the best record in the National League, and no World Series was played that year. And people say, well, we got to look at the Expos heroes. I, for one, abandoned that thought. For me, the Washington Nationals history started in 2005, and I could care less about the heroes in Montreal.
Once in a while you'll see a fan. Actually, I was at the no-hitter the other day, and I saw a guy in a full Expos uniform and cap. And so there are some guys that have that sort of retro vibe to them. I think most Washington fans kind of feel like you do, that this team is kind of a continuation of the old Senators teams. You know, that's the lineage from 1901 through today, and the Expos are just kind of like a footnote. But some people do really like the Expos, and so I think there are two schools of thought, but I think most people are in your category.
When the Senators left, Bob Short was reviled in Washington. I mean, he was hated. There's an interesting footnote about when Bob Short ran for the United States Senate a few years later.
Right, so Short, after moving the team to Texas, a couple of years later sells the team and decides to get back into politics. He actually worked as a treasurer for Humphrey in '68. And so he goes back to his home state of Minnesota. There's that state again, by the way, you know, the city that took our first team. And here he goes, he runs for Senate, and some baseball fans of Washington, they're following this with some interest, and they decide to take an ad out in a Minneapolis newspaper, a half-page ad, basically almost like a baseball political ad, or talking about all the broken promises that Bob Short made to Washington. And it says, you know, Minnesota has some great people like, you know, Mondale and others. Humphrey. Does Bob Short live up to these traditions? We think not. And it turns out that Dave Durenberger, the Republican opponent, made copies of those ads with these guys' permission, and he handed them out at Minnesota Vikings games that year. And Short lost the race to Durenberger.
I can remember I was a partner in a Minneapolis, Washington law firm at that time, and one of my partners from Minneapolis called me and just chewed me out for those ads, although I had nothing to do. I supported the ad, thank you, but I had nothing to do with it. Griffith Stadium, an interesting history. Were the Senators the only club there?
No, in fact, Clark Griffith got a lot of his revenue from the Homestead Grays, which is a team that was technically based in Homestead, Pennsylvania, but after a few years played almost all their games here in Washington at Griffith Stadium. And they had
the Negro
National League, right. And they had a couple of great superstars, Josh Gibson and Buck Leonard, who both met with Griffith because Griffith was getting pressure in the 40s. This is before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. And Griffith asked these guys, you know, what do you think about all this pressure? You know, people were saying I should sign you guys. And, you know, they kind of had a low-key attitude. They said, we'll let other people make that case for us. But I think Griffith wasn't very seriously entertaining the idea of signing these players.
Why?
Two reasons. One, as you point out, you know, that they played here in Griffith Stadium, so he got a lot of the revenue from them, from the Homestead Grays. And also, you know, Griffith, by all accounts, was not a racist, but he was not a bold person either. It would have taken a very bold move to break the color barrier anywhere, as it was for Brian Tricker in 1947 in Brooklyn, but especially so in Washington. Washington was not the city it is today. It was a very conservative city. As I mentioned, it was really considered part of the South back then. It would have shaken things up if he had done it. It would have been a great thing, but he didn't really have the moxie to do it, unfortunately.
And of course, the other tenant was the Washington Redskins, who played from 1937 through 1960 at Griffith Stadium, and that too. Clark Griffith was not a man of means. As opposed to so many of the other major league owners. Griffith, was a former pitcher in the major leagues who then became manager, managed the Senators, eventually put together enough money to buy the club. He bought a minority interest, then he bought the controlling interest. But the Washington Senators and Griffith Stadium were his sole source of revenue. And so, I mean, he was thought of as being very conservative when it came to money, and I think he valued the playing in Griffith Stadium of the Homestead Grays and the Washington Redskins. Does the book address the presidential openers?
Yes, in some detail, actually. It goes back over 100 years, the tradition of presidents throwing out the first ball, starting with Taft, who was added to the president's race recently. And the tradition through most of the 20th century is very different from what you've seen today. You know, we're used to seeing the president stand out on the pitcher's mound and pray to God he doesn't bounce the ball, and sometimes he does. But in the old days, it was an easier task. The president would sit in his seat, first row behind the first base dugout usually. Players from both teams would be along the first base line, and they would be basically waiting to catch the ball, like brides trying to catch a bouquet. And the president would just throw it up for grabs. Whoever would get it would bring it over to the president, who would sign the ball for him.
Why did they change it?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Well, occasionally a player in the scramble to get the ball would get injured, and that Harry Truman set a record because he was ambidextrous. He threw out the first pitch both left-handed and right-handed, and it was the presidential opener, which some of us maintain still that the first game of the season still should be played here in Washington.
Definitely.
It was easier with the old Senators because the first game traditionally was played in Cincinnati for the National League and played in Washington for the American League. But that Cincinnati and Washington both being in the National League, they couldn't do that anymore. But it's a tradition that we used to delight in, and it used to be the only game that the Senators would sell out the entire year. What about RFK Stadium, which actually was DC Stadium, and then renamed for Robert F. Kennedy after his death? What do you know about that?
Well, it was a very raucous place. I think I bet many of you probably remember games there when the Nationals first started. It had a certain vibe to it. I mean, it didn't have that much. It had character, but not in the way that some of the more modern or throwback stadiums looked like. I mean, it just was kind of a typical cookie-cutter stadium. It was symmetrical dimensions, but the place would really rock when the team would score or have a big rally. In fact, Dan Snyder has talked about trying to recreate that kind of vibe at a new stadium in Washington, and he hopes to bring his football team back to Washington. The
stadium was the first of the cookie-cutter stadiums in the 1960s. And in 1961, it hosted the first game of the two All-Star games that year. And in 1969, only 8 years later, it hosted the All-Star game again. And there's an interesting story about that. In '69, for the centennial of baseball, the game was supposed to be played in Cincinnati. However, the new ballpark in Cincinnati was not ready, and so they had to shift the game here to Washington. It was scheduled for a night game, and we had a horrendous storm that night. The dugouts were flooded, and they had to postpone the game. They played it the next day. Frank Howard played, hit a home run for the American League team. I can't recall who won the game, but I know that Howard's blast was greeted by the hometown fans. Let's talk about the reincarnation of baseball here in Washington. The first years were not particularly happy years, maybe at the box office, but not down on the field, except for the first half of the first season.
Right, the first half of the first season, the Nationals were in first place. Nobody saw that coming. The Expos were not a very good team coming in, and the Nationals had this incredible record in one-run games. I think they were 20 games over or something like that, or 15 over. And the second half, they had the exact opposite record and the exact opposite record in one-run games. So they finished at 500, which was actually pretty good given the kind of team they were. And then they tanked after that. They were terrible for several years. But they'd actually paid some dividends because they had the worst record in baseball 2 years in a row. And in baseball, as in other sports, the worst team gets the first draft choice the next year. So they got Steven Strasburg and Bryce Harper, two of their superstars they built a team around. And other good players, Drew Storn was in the same draft as Strasburg, a number 10 pick. So they had a lot of really good draft choices. I think that this team, was built on the foundation in some part on the losing team of the mid-2000s.
And what about this year's team? You have any great players on this year's team?
I think you do. I think Harper and Strasburg among them, but nobody really had a great season. Nobody had like an MVP type season, which is what makes this team really special. I think they're a very balanced team. You know, their lineup is very good from 1 to 8. Their starting rotation is very deep. You know, I think the depth and the depth is really the key thing that's made them so accomplished. You know, interesting. They have almost the identical record to the 1924 team. Both teams finished 30 games over 500. And as we mentioned earlier, they both had rookie managers. One big difference is the Nationals had 152 home runs. They've got a lot of sluggers. The Nationals the Senators in 1924 hit 22 home runs as a team. Now, people were hitting. It's true that there wasn't as much power back then, but just to give you an idea, Babe Ruth of the Yankees that year hit 46 home runs, more than double all of Washington's.
That baseball has changed a little bit, huh?
Yeah.
What can you tell us about their opponent today, the Giants?
You know, they're a tough team. They looked really great the other night. There was some trash talking going on. You may have heard about Tim Hudson suggesting that the Nationals might not have, let's just call it inner fortitude that the Giants have. Well, we'll see how that plays out, though.
Let's get a reaction from the audience. It won't be able to see it, but how many here are diehard Senator fans and are, Nationals fans? Old habits are diehard. How many of you are Washington baseball fans and have tickets to today's game? Let's indicate it by applause for. Fred and I were a little concerned earlier in the week because the Pirates and the Giants were playing, and if the Pirates had won, you all would be at the ballpark right now, and we would be probably talking to an empty house. So
you would have the game on the big screen behind us, right?
So we were at least for one day rooting for the Giants. Fred, what about in the American League? You think we might have a Beltway World Series or a Parkway World Series?
You know, there's a possibility. It's always hard to predict in the playoffs. The Orioles are a very good team. And, you know, the Orioles franchise has an interesting connection to the old Senators. Before the Orioles moved here, they were the old St. Louis Browns. And for years, they were kind of Washington's partner at the bottom of the American League. They're both terrible teams. But at least, you know, if misery loves company, at least Washington had some company with the Browns. When the Browns moved to Baltimore in 1954, they became good very quickly. And then Washington kind of had last place all to itself for most of the 1950s.
That's not exactly what you want, but at least they were unique in that sense.
Right.
And of course, there is now a current controversy going on between the Nationals and the Baltimore Orioles. When the Expos moved here in 2005, part of the deal for the Expos moving here was that Peter Angelos, the owner of the Baltimore Orioles, gave up certain territorial rights. As a footnote, when the Browns moved to Baltimore, Clark Griffith gave up certain territorial rights
without opposing anything, right?
Right,
yeah,
right. And the Orioles agreed. The Jerry Hoffberger, who owned the brewery, agreed to a substantial sponsorship package for 1954. But when the Expos moved here, the Major League Baseball acceded to the wish of Peter Angelos, and the Mid-Atlantic Sports Network was created with majority ownership in perpetuity to the Baltimore Orioles. Masson, the Mid-Atlantic Sports Network, carries both the Orioles and the Nationals. And at some point in the future, the ownership will be 2/3 Orioles, 1/3 Nationals. And there is a controversy going on right now involving whether Masson owes the Nationals more money than the contract, than the Orioles and Masson are willing to pay the Nationals. It could get a little sticky. And on that note, maybe we ought to open it up to questions. We remind you that there are microphones in each of the major aisles, and if you want, please offer some questions.
Could you talk about where, if any place, black fans could go in Griffith Stadium and how that worked? I'm talking about for games of the Senators, not for games of the Grays, obviously.
Yeah, they when the Senators were playing here, and the Homestead Grays played, most of the blacks gathered in the right field stands. I don't know whether, in fact, they were permitted to go into other parts of the ballpark, but they all sat in the right field stands.
In fact, there's a really famous photo of a knocked out Babe Ruth. He crashed into the right field wall, and he's actually on his back. And you see lots of black fans looking in, just watching with a lot of interest. And that's because that's where all the fans were seated.
That's where they were seated.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Let's go over
A couple of historical notes and then a question. One, that marvelous newsreel, which I just saw for the first time last night. I was glad they captured the series-winning hit, but it missed a moment that I learned about as a kid. I grew up here, native Washingtonian. I was always told that that hit became a hit only because it took a bad hop as it skipped through the infield, and so the fielder could not capture it. I'm sorry that that moment of Senator's lore was not captured. Secondly, just to clarify what happened on the last day, the second version of Senators left town, my brother was there at that final game, and I'm sure he'd want me to tell you it wasn't just that the fans stormed the field in the bottom of the ninth. They rioted. They tore the place apart, quite literally tore the place apart. So I just wanted to make that point clear. Question: you got to have heart from the movie and the play Damn Yankees. There's his nickname in the movie for Joe Hardy became Shoeless Joe. Right. Shoeless Joe from Hannibal Moe. That harkens right back to one of the most unfortunate chapters of baseball history, Shoeless Joe Jackson, and then the 1919 Black Sox scandal. Why in the world would they want to invoke that ghost?
Maybe maybe that's songwriting for you. I can't answer that, but Shoeless Joe from Hannibal Moe was a delightful part of that movie. Let me pick up on a comment that you made about Earl McNeely's hit, which hit the pebble and bounced over Lindstrom's head. It's a shame you couldn't see that in the film, but coincidentally or ironically, the same thing happened when Bucky Harris in the 8th inning got a double to drive in the tying runs. He hit a ball down the third baseline. It hit a pebble and bounced over Lindstrom's head as well. That pebble ought to be in the Washington Sports Hall of Fame.
You know, there's a legendary sports writer named Fred Lieb who was describing that last play, the game-winning hit. And he said maybe the millions of fans, because Washington was really America's favorite that year, maybe the millions of fans were able to kind of use their
psychic
power to get, he's a different life, but to get the ball to just take a bad bounce. Yeah. And then, interestingly enough, after the game, Jack Bentley, the losing pitcher of the Giants, said that the good Lord just couldn't see a fine fellow like Walter Johnson lose again. Now, can you imagine a player today citing God, rooting for the other team? And we certainly see it all the time for their team, but never for their team. So that was pretty cool.
Let's go.
I'm wondering about these tapes that Mr. Ferriero mentioned in his introduction of the conversations between President Nixon and Mayor Washington about the possibility of baseball returning. What's on those? What were they like?
Well, Nixon talked about maybe the Cleveland Indians moving here. He said they have a really awful lakefront stadium that nobody goes to. The Indians actually had the second worst attendance in the American League the last year the Washington was here. Of course, Washington was worse, so they figured, well, maybe go for the low-hanging fruit. The White Sox were another team. Nixon didn't think that Chicago could support two teams. And he also was very optimistic about Washington getting another team very soon. He thought with the bicentennial coming up in 1976 that Major League Baseball would use that as an opportunity to come back. Well, not only did they not bring a team to Washington, they went outside the country. They had the Toronto Blue Jays and then, of course, the Seattle Mariners they picked them in 1976 to start playing in '77, and it was obviously many years before we got a team back here.
The so-called creator of baseball has his eternal resting place right across the river here in Arlington National Cemetery, and people still leave baseballs there. I'm talking about Abner Doubleday, and the title of your book references 1859, and I'm curious about your thoughts about the origins of baseball.
Well, I think the Abner Doubleday story has been mostly discredited, but I'll take that question as an opportunity to talk about the early days of Washington baseball. It's hard to believe that there was baseball being played here before the Civil War, but there were a couple of teams, basically government clerks, that would play baseball, and they really, aside from the chewing tobacco, they tried to make it kind of like a gentlemanly sport, and you would get fined like 10 cents or 25 cents for spitting, for contesting an umpire's call, those kinds of things. So it was a very different mentality. The sport got a lot more brutish in the 1880s, turned professional, and kind of became part of what we recognize baseball as today.
Yes, sir.
My question is, you know the story about Pudge Fisk coaxing the ball to be inbounds, the home run in Fenway Park?
Sure.
I read that the TV camera, at that time the TV camera rules were follow the ball. And I read that a rat ran in front of the cameraman, which distracted him from the ball. Ergo, he picked up the batter. Do you know if that story is true?
It's a great story.
I read that same story. I think the New York Times had a story about that a few years ago. So.
Well, it was on Wikipedia.
Okay.
The other
Don't
question.
trust Wikipedia.
The other question I have is, why did they move from the bases being sacks to these plastic or metal or whatever they are now, and where an example of Bryce Harper hurting his hand, sliding into second base? Why did they decide to have these fancy bases instead of a sack of dirt?
I can't answer that. It's certainly to have it anchored with a spike in the ground will make certain that the base won't be moved when somebody slides into it. Certainly sliding feet first, but maybe the fact that there isn't much give in it was responsible for Ryan Zimmerman's hand and Bryce Harper's hand this year. I don't know, but I don't think we're gonna convince baseball to change that. Good point, though. Yes, sir.
According to some old baseball cards I used to have from the 1950s, the Washington team was named the Nationals for a few years. Do you know the background of that?
Yeah, the official name of the team through most of the 20th century was the Washington Nationals, but fans mostly called them the Senators. And if you look at the newspapers from those days in Washington and elsewhere, you saw them used interchangeably, Washington Nationals, Senators. Sometimes they're called the Griffmen for Clark Griffith. Sometimes they were called the Bucks when Bucky Harris was the manager. So they had more colorful names back then. It wasn't until the mid-'50s, so you raise a good point, that they actually officially changed their name to the Senators. And so the second franchise that was awarded in 1961, they were known as the Senators throughout, from 1961 to 71. The earlier franchise had these different names that they would go through.
Yeah, and of course, for the newspaper headline writers, they wanted to use Nats. And
Yeah.
even when the club was known as the Senators, everybody in town knew that they were nicknamed the Nats and nicknamed the Nationals, although they weren't quite certain of the history. There was a question when the Expos moved here. The name Washington Nationals had been trademarked by somebody not associated with the team, and there was a legal fight going on as to what rights the Major League Baseball, which owned the team at that time, what rights the Major League Baseball had to call the team the Washington Nationals, the ownership of that name being owned by somebody else through a trademark. It was eventually settled, but I know that I got a call from Major League Baseball asking me if I knew the history of Nationals versus Senators, and it was the same as you've stated. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that Clark Griffith's family relied on the team and the rentals to the stadium for family income. I just wanted to know, isn't it the case that when Calvin Griffith finally sold the Twins, that they in fact were the last family that actually relied on the sports revenue for their living expenses, that all the way up until they sold the team, Clark Griffith's nephew, that's one reason why they were, as you indicated, so cheap, although they did win the World Series in the mid-'60s. That was the last team. That was the last team
They
to.
did win the World Series, did they?
They lost,
They
the World
lost to the
Series.
Dodgers.
They lost?
Right.
In '65.
Well, they went to the World Series
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah. And not only did the Griffith family rely on the ball club and the ballpark for their income, but they relied on it for their employment. You had Calvin, who was the president of the club, Clark, young Clark, who was a vice president of the club, the Robertson brothers, who were members of the family. They were both employed by the club, and so it truly was a family affair. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, as owners go, as owners of clubs, and the Lerners are particularly seem to be doing very well, and especially, and there's a lot of comparison to other owners of sports teams in the area that,
You want to be more specific?
no, well, yes. What would you say? I mean, do you agree that they're doing very well, and as compared to other owners of local or senators and so on, and maybe just in general, what are the attributes of a good owner, and what makes to make a good club?
I think they're obviously doing something right. I mean, they're in the postseason for the second time in 3 years. They've been willing to pay when they feel like need to, like the Jason Worth signing, and they've had to pay a lot of money to these number one draft choices. The Lerners have said, though, that they're pretty much maxed out. They said that earlier, right before the season started. So it'll be interesting to see how many of these players they can hold on to, especially as these great young players hit arbitration and then free agency. I think they've done a good job. I think the main thing they've done is kind of got out of the way and let a really good baseball man like Rizzo run the team, the general manager. So I think that's an important attribute. I'm a Knicks fan, unfortunately, in another sport, and I can tell you that an owner that meddles incessantly is the worst. So I think the Lerners have done a great job in letting their baseball people run the baseball team.
Just from a personal standpoint, I love the Lerners. The baseball here in Washington over the last few years has been absolutely wonderful. Even 2012, where they lost the fifth game, the season was magical. Now maybe that comes from somebody who's been following Washington baseball since 1948, but boy, a winning record, that's great. I love the Lerners. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, can you tell us a little bit about, I don't remember his name, but his nickname was Dummy, and the influences on the hand signals that we use in baseball today?
A guy named Dummy Hoy, who played in the 1880s. He was a deaf mute and actually was turned into a show many years later. And to your question about the hand signals, there's sort of a legend. I'm not sure if it's true.
Okay.
That's the origin, because he obviously had to use hand signals, and that's how players started to use them. But I don't know if that's ever been confirmed.
Do you know which team he played for? Because I know in that stadium they have a picture of him hanging up.
Oh, he
So
played
was
for
he a
the
Senators?
The old Washington Senators.
Okay.
I think or the Nationals. Can't remember what they're called, but in the 1880s.
Okay, thank you.
Like many baseball fans, my interest leans towards the stadiums themselves over the years. And I have never been able to figure out one way or another whether in the old Griffith Stadium there was a house out there. Do you know the story of why that house was out there? That somebody had said that it wasn't sold, the guy wouldn't sell. I've never been able to really track down whether it was an apocryphal story or not. Would you know that?
Well, I hope you're not suggesting there was a house inside of the stadium.
No.
No, but there was. If you look at pictures of Griffith Stadium, you'll see in dead center field there's a nook, and I think it's because the owner of the house didn't want to sell, and they had to build the stadium around the house.
This is before eminent domain was used actually to build stadiums.
Good point.
And just an interesting side note to that, in the 24 World Series, you got a sense from this newsreel about how many people were in the stadium, but there were actually people on top of houses, wooden houses outside the ballpark that paid 50 cents a ticket to watch the game, kind of like you see with Wrigley Field. So it was an amazing time where not just people in the stadium, but outside, and people who couldn't make it to the ballpark would stand outside the Washington Post or the old Washington Evening Star, where they would post the scores half inning by half inning, and that was as good as it got back then.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thanks. If I can squeeze in two quick ones. After the Nationals win the World Series this year, do you think that'll be enough to turn DC from a football town into a baseball town?
I'll let you handle that. But you've done the Redskins and the Senators.
I don't know. I'll defer on that question. The Nationals are drawing well. You know, the question by this other gentleman over here about stadiums, you have probably noticed that the size of major league stadiums is shrinking, that they're no longer building the 60,000 seat stadiums. They're building stadiums that seat 36, 37,000 people. Maybe you can cram in 40, which of course enhances the demand for tickets. On a big game, you better make sure that that you get in line early for a ticket, otherwise you're going to be shut out. Will the success of the Nationals this year turn the town into a baseball town? Let's say it'll turn the town into a big sports town.
Yeah. Second one, if I can, going back to some of the comments about the African American history, the Negro League history, and all that. One thing I think you notice at Nationals games, demographically, there aren't a lot of African Americans there. I haven't seen a study about it, but I think it's noticeable. On the other hand, at Redskins games, very mixed crowd. I was just wondering, do you think there's anything about maybe the history of baseball with the fact that there was segregation in baseball, the Griffith, you mentioned Griffith Stadium, they tended to sit all in one area. Do you think that's in some way perhaps influencing, the fan base today in any way, positively or negatively, or do you think that there's no, what I'm really getting at is it would be nice to see baseball. One reason maybe that we're not a baseball town is that we don't have the African-American fan base for baseball that you do for football. It would be nice to see baseball overcome that problem and overcome the history. And so, rambling question, but any thoughts about it?
Fred, you want to?
I don't think that there's anything about the history of baseball segregating, because football segregated too. And the owner of the Washington Redskins, he was actually forced to integrate his team by the Kennedy administration because they wanted to play at RFK, which was a federally funded park. So I think that it's really more football is more popular among black players as well as fans. Kids play it more, so you'll see that reflected on the field. There aren't many black players. Yeah. I think it's under 10% now, whereas in football it's a much higher percentage. So I think that's probably what's drawing the higher fans to football, more fans to football than there are to baseball.
Yeah. Washington Post front page today has a story addressing that issue.
Yeah, that's ironic.
It's a concern of Major League Baseball. They want to generate more interest in the black communities across the nation. Yeah. I haven't read the Post piece, but I suspect that point is made there.
Yeah, thanks.
We've got to wrap it up.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Fred and myself, thank you very much for being here. Go Nats.
Yeah.